Hello and welcome back to our series on my new book, Creation's Week, a macrocosm of Creation Week. And today we're going to be looking at the first day in totality. So that's Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And so as we consider the fact that in this work we're looking at the fact that each day of creation is like a microcosm of what the first 1,000 years of creation is going to exemplify, or there's a theme in each day of the creation that correlates to what happens during that first 1,000 year period. That's kind of what the whole thing is about, and of course with it is a verse by verse commentary expounding each aspect. So talking about each verse and what it means, but also talking about the prophetic implications of what each day means. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Is we've already covered Genesis 1, 1 through 5 in terms of the commentary. And so now we're going to be looking today at the prophetic implications. Okay, thank you, James. Let me switch over. I was trying something with the mic, so let me switch over. Let me know how this is. Is that any better? Can you let me know if that's better, James? I just switched something. Okay, all right. So I got to work on that, but thank you for catching that, because I was testing out a new microphone actually, so I need to work on it. But anyway, okay, so just to reiterate, we're looking at the prophetic implications of creation's week. That means the 7,000 years of creation, which we're in the middle of, towards the end of actually. And then looking at how each individual day is a representation of what happens during that 1,000 year period. So for instance, day 1 should have a correlation to what happens during the first God day, if you will. In other words, from year 0 to 1000 AM. AM is a designation meaning Anno Mundi, meaning year since creation of the world. So for the first 1,000 years, what happened during that 1,000 years should be thematically represented in the first day of creation. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. All right, so let's take a look now, and I'm going to switch over to the text. Okay, so we're looking here again at day 1, and I just put it down from 1 a.m. Again, that means Anno Mundi, that is year since the creation of the world. That's what that means. And how that correlates to what happens during the first 1,000 years of creation. And so that's it's an interesting concept, because we don't really know, at least historically speaking, we don't have a very strong record of anything that happened during that first 1,000 years. And we also don't have very much, biblically speaking, of what happened during that first 1,000 years. There's only a few passages in Genesis that talk about it. For instance, Genesis chapter 3 and 4 are some clues as to what happened. Also, we have Genesis chapter 5, where we get a big clue of some of the things that happened. And then that's about it. There's really not much else to go on, either historically or scripturally. There is a few passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel that give us a few little hints, and then there's also, of course, just those opening chapters of Genesis, and then that's really it. We really don't know too much else about the details of what happened. But despite that, that kind of actually goes along perfectly, because we also know very little about this first day, other than what's right here in Scripture. We don't know too much. So We know that God manifested light into the earth domain, and we know that God divided the light from the darkness. We talked about that in the opening sessions of this video series. And then we know that the evening and the morning were the first day, and we talked about that last time. How that could be these words in Hebrew, erev and boker, could definitely be speaking of how things God was pronouncing order into the universe, and as each day transpired, there was a greater measure of order and a lessening of disorder or entropy. And so, because evening and morning are days which are time periods during the day, where at evening things become less discernible, they become more obscured, and they become less apparent as things just kind of fade into darkness. And then in morning, things become more and more clear and more visible and more apparent and more distinct. And so those words, erev and boker in Hebrew, might have a deeper meaning than simply what we've come to use them by to describe those times of the day. So we talked about all that last time, so we won't go into that anymore here, but let's look now at this concept that we bring out in this work. The first day includes the creation of heaven and earth and all the raw physical material of the earth, most prominently water, as well as darkness and light and the division of them. Okay, so if, as this work supposes, a quote-unquote God day is 1,000 years, and we get that from Psalm 90, and also we get it from 2 Peter 3:8, then the first day or first 1,000 years of creation should include conceptually these same concepts or tenets of the first 24-hour day of creation. So in speaking of these God days, instead of trying to reconcile various BC timelines, theories, okay, like Usher, he has his dates, which go back to, 4004 BC, based on the way he reckoned it. Other people have done it slightly differently. The Jewish timeline has it a little bit different. Pastor Sandy has it a little bit different, the timeline that he uses. So, but everybody knows that we're right around the 6th day. We're right around the end of that. So, everybody knows, whatever the exact date is, we're right around that time frame as we speak. So, but what happened during the first 1,000 years, and we get this from Genesis chapter 5, is that you have from 687 Anno Mundi to 987 Anno Mundi, you have Enoch, who is the 7th from Adam, 7 being a significant number representing completion and frequently used to identify the church. And so you have this number, 7th from Adam, Enoch. It specifically says that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, and he was translated or raptured to be in heaven with God. And so it's interesting that in the first 1,000 years, let's go back up here and we see that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? And so we have these two domains, the domain of heaven and the domain of earth. And it was specifically the earth domain which was without form and void. We already went over that in the opening session. Okay. And then notice that darkness is imposed, and that is to shield or protect God's creation, particularly the earth domain, from his manifest glorious presence. In other words, we wouldn't be able to handle seeing God in mortal frame. And so it's a way that God shrouds himself and protects his unrestrained, unrestricted, glorious light from being seen in every corner of the universe. So he separates this domain, and he allows a certain amount of light in to the earth domain that he manifests, but there's also a mixture of that darkness which he created and the light which he manifested. So there's a mixture, and It's there so that we can have a taste of God's light and goodness and order and discernment and distinction from evil. But there's also a measure of darkness where we have to take it by faith that God is there and that He does love us and He does want a relationship with us. And we do have the opportunity and the ability to receive that and accept it or not. Okay, so here where it says, that the light was good and God divided the light from the darkness, meaning that He made it distinct. So He made it very clear that this was light, this was darkness. He gives the light a name, day, a label, and He gives the light, the Hebrew layil, a darkness. He gives that a label, night. And then this whole thing transpires to where, the evening, the non-discernible things fading into darkness, and the morning things becoming more discernible and more distinct and clear. He designates that as this way that He demarcates each day's progression. Okay, so with that said, we have a person from the earth domain being translated to the heaven. Now, what else do we have from Scripture? We know from Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 that we have an angel, Lucifer, who is also known as Hasatan, the adversary, Satan. We know that we have a heavenly being, Lucifer, who was created perfect in beauty and all the things that it says in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. We have him falling and being focused predominantly with the earth domain. So he wants to take over the earth domain, and so he is kind of like the greatest of all the angels, and he rebels and he wants to take over the earth domain. And Enoch represents fallen man, but he's redeemed and he is translated into the heaven domain. So right there you have, in that first 1,000 year period, you have a heavenly being fall to become part of a fallen earth domain, and you have a fallen earth being, Enoch, translated to be part of the heaven domain. So right there you see that within this first 1,000 years you have this prophetic implication of the divergence between Enoch and Lucifer. Okay, so that's one thing. The other the things that we talk about here are another interesting aspect is we know that in Genesis chapter 2, God tells Adam that in the day that he eats from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that you will surely die. And a lot of people say, okay, well, that means that Adam died spiritually on that day. However, if you think about it in terms of God days, well, the only person who's ever lived who was synced to God time before the fall was Adam. So Adam was walking with God directly before the fall. So he more than likely was physiologically synced with God time and God days. So in other words, when he falls, he is it specifically says in Genesis chapter 5 that he dies at the age of 930 years. So 930 years after creation. So you can actually take this passage literally, that within the day when Adam ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he died within that 1,000 year time period. So again, you can take it literally if you apply the 1,000 years equals a day equals 1,000 years construct. Okay, so in that case, you have 70 years left over, and it's very interesting to see that 70 is the amount of time that it says a typical lifespan will be. So 70 is like with 70. We have that from the Psalms in Psalm 90 verse 10. And so that's also the same psalm where we get the whole 1,000 years equals one day, and one day is 1,000 years, which 2 Peter 3:8 quotes from. So I find that interesting because the difference of 1,000 minus 930 is 70. And so Adam lived that first 930 years, and then the difference being 70, we see that's the age of like a generation, a typical lifespan of a person. And then it's also the lifespan of certain individuals, like for instance, King David, who's a type or a shadow or a foreshadowing of Christ. So you can see those types of things all line up perfectly. Okay, so another interesting thing about this is that if you look at it carefully, you'll see that during that first 1,000 years, there's only 2 deaths recorded in all of Scripture. So the only people that are known to have died during that first 1,000 year period are, of course, Adam. We just talked about that. He was 930 years old. And then the other person who died was his son, Abel. So you have Adam, who died because of sin, and then because sin entered the world and it was a fallen state, uh, the sin of Adam's other son, Cain, ended up murdering his son Abel. Okay, so when you have that picture, you can see that fallen man ends in death and murder, because Cain spiritually died there, and God was not going to have his seed or his line of redemption through Jesus Christ. He wasn't going to have that come through someone whose defining characteristic was a murderer, which would be Cain. So that's where God appoints this other son that they have later called Seth. And at the age of 130 years old, um, Adam and his wife Eve have Seth, a new child. And this new son, Seth, is the one that God blesses that particular line. And that's the line that comes forth and brings forth Enoch, and also later on Noah, and also later on Abraham, and also later on David, and then ultimately and eventually Christ himself. Okay. So the 2 deaths that are recorded again are Adam and Abel. Just a quick side note. If you read Genesis chapter 4, you might say, well, what about, it says Lamech, a descendant of Cain, he boasts of actually killing 2 people, a man and a young man. He boasts of killing them. However, it doesn't tell us the years of Cain's line, but we can infer that because Lamech was the last descendant of Cain before the flood, and the flood didn't take place until the second millennia. So we can infer that Lamech was living actually in post 1000 AM. So in other words, those 2 people that he talks about that he kills in Genesis chapter 4, they're not counted because they were actually killed after the 1,000 year mark. And you can get that from several places because there's a lot of ancient literature that talks about the female from Cain's line who actually ends Cain's genealogy, who's Naamah. There's a lot of theories that Naamah is actually one of Noah's. There's a debate on whether Noah had 1 or 2 wives, but for his 3 children. But Naamah is actually theorized to be one of Noah's wives, and that she was a direct relation to Lamech, the end of Cain's line. Okay, so obviously for her to be alive at that time, it would be well past 1000 AD, or AM, sorry. Okay, so anyway, that's what kind of how the book is structured. So you can see that it goes through verse by verse commentary on each verse of each day of creation, Genesis 1:1, 1:2, 1:3, and so on. And then at the end of each day, there's a section where we look at the prophetic implications of how that day corresponds to that first 1,000 year period, or day 2 corresponds to the second 1,000 year period, and day 3 corresponds to the third 1,000 day period, and so on. Okay, so that's it for this session. I'm trying to keep these as short as possible. I think what are we at, like about 20 minutes? Yeah. So trying to keep these at about 15, 20, 25 minutes each, so they're a little bit easier to watch and digest. And hope you enjoyed this video, and see you in the next one. God bless.